Because the history of the United States is arranged around what we call a construct of race, race is a construct, it is not real. Community change can't happen unless we would make change or understand how racism acts as a barrier to self-sufficiency and to self-development. So this forum is going to operate on certain premises, and that's because racism has been consciously and systematically erected in our society. We're not going to reduce the idea of other kinds of oppressions. They exist, and we know that. But we're going to talk about racism primarily and economics in the United States. We're not going to talk about those oppressions that we know occur all over the world. We're going to be here at home dealing with our at-home issues. We often hear of how multicultural our society is, especially here in Cumberland County. We have many, many different kinds of people, many people from different parts of the world. While many cultures may be represented in a society, multiculturalism in itself, in and of itself, does not, may not, and does not represent an important piece, and that's co-equality. So we're going to be dealing with that today. There are great differences in values of equality. Many are built on culture, but especially they are built around race. If we were in a pluralistic society where there is representation of so many different races and different groups, the society is pluralistic only when all are seen and treated as equals. So most people describe racism in certain ways, and one of three ways. So we have the one way is individual or personal racism. And individual or personal racism, as it says, is a belief based on a premise of a hierarchy of races. Two characteristics are internalized superiority by one group and internalized inferiority by another. Cultural racism, that encompasses the collective identity of a group. There's an assumption that the values and the standards and the cultural habits of one group are the norm, and everyone is measured against that norm. It's when one group uses power to perpetuate their cultural heritage and imposes it on others, while at the same time destroying or appropriating the cultures of others. And we're going to be addressing that issue of appropriation of other people's cultures while not giving up power. So we have young white boys who wear their pants down in what they consider ghetto style. But when it's time to finish college and go on to jobs, there is no sharing of power. They put on a suit and a tie and enter into the hierarchy, into areas of power. Cultural racism often supports and sustains both personal and institutional racism. Institutional racism. That is a systemic use of power by a dominant racial group at the expense of non-dominant groups. Institutions representing institutional racism have great power to reward and to penalize. And we'll be addressing the issues of rewards and penalization. And our focus today is on institutional racism, primarily. If we started on personal racism or personal issues and things that have happened, we would spend days and days talking about the insults and the pain and so on. What we want to do is look at the institutions that are in place. While we can examine forms of individual cultures as well as institutions, the goal is to move us on a continuum toward becoming an anti-racist, multicultural community. So we have some core concepts we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about race. First of all, it is a scientifically discredited term formerly used to describe biologically distinct groups of persons. The term race is a way of categorizing people generally based on phenotype or differences of facial characteristics, skin color, or hair type. Phenotype, or the way one looks, may not correlate to genetic makeup. You cannot look at anyone and really determine what they are. You can only do that genetically. Sometimes we do it. We say, oh, that person's an Indian, or that one is you can't really do that because people can look many different ways. And many people in this society look as though they may be people of color, but they are mixed. I dare say everybody in this room is mixed with some other so-called race, whether they look like it or not, from the blondest hair, blue-eyed person to the person with the darkest skin and most super curly hair. I would almost guarantee you in the United States of America they are triracial at some level. Now, racism is the unequal treatment of a population group purely because of its possession of physical or other characteristics socially defined as denoting a particular race. For our purposes, we define it as prejudice plus power. It is racial prejudice plus the power to sustain that prejudice, the constructed power to maintain the privileges of one ethnic racial group over another. That is what racism is. So I may be biased. I may not like the way Roger looks, you know, but I have no power to control the outcomes or sustain that control over his life or the lives of people here, but institutions do. So we want to keep that in mind. If we get into personal, we'd be all day. But let's look at those institutions. They're big and they're hard to look at because they're invisible for the most part. But you know as well as I do that they're there and they're in place. All right, let's talk about power. What is power? The ability to control cultural, material, and human resources. The ability to institutionalize a system of rewards and punishments based on the way in which social goods and services are distributed. Very important. Having access and or control over the systems and institutions of a society. Okay, let's keep that in mind when we're talking about power, because sometimes we think there are different types of power, and there are different levels of power, and there are individuals of color, and there are Black Americans who have certain kinds of power, but they do not have power over institutions. If you look at an institution, for example, such as the Congress, the Senate of the United States, well, how many Black Americans are senators in this society? Who knows? One, today. One, right? But we are representative as what percentage of the society? 11 to 12%. And if you look at CEOs of companies and all of these institutions that are in place, hierarchies in education, CEOs of major corporations, speaking to a continuum to become an anti-racist, multicultural community. And it's important. We're a very multicultural country, but we're not anti-racist. We're very multicultural, but we're not anti-racist. So we want to really look at what some of those stages are. In the very beginning stages, you have racial and cultural differences are seen as deficits. People may be tolerant of racial and cultural differences. Eventually, people can reach a stage where racial and cultural differences are seen as assets. And what happens in stage one, you have what would be called an exclusive and an excluding community. It enforces the racist status quo of dominance and exclusion of racial and ethnic peoples through historical and traditional conditions. And we know that that existed. Just changing the 1954 law, desegregation law, in fact made it illegal to continue in that way. Did it change it de facto? No, but it did change in the law. To become tolerant of a limited number of racial and ethnic peoples, and those are people with the proper perspectives, and we're going to talk about that. Certain proper credentials who become acceptable. And then the third step is racial and cultural differences seen as assets. And that is a symbolic change. And so what we begin seeing are some differences there. People begin to see a symbolic change committed to inclusion of racial and ethnic peoples. There's some symbolic inclusion. And you know that companies, and I remember this very well, began to recruit for someone of color, but one who won't make waves. And those of us who maybe have a little more gray in our hair remember that happening. That sometimes people who should not have been in positions were put in there simply because they were a person of color. So we wanted to have that kind of symbolic change happening in the country. Eventually, we get to an analytic change where there is a desire to eliminate discriminatory practices, and we become sensitive to differences. Now, everyone in this room is not on the same point on the continuum. Some people sitting in here may still be exclusive and want to enforce racist status quo and want to remain dominant and want to remain exclusive. Some people are passive still, tolerant, and say, well, you know, but they're not going to do anything. They only want to be around a certain kind of person of color. You know, only if you have certain kinds of credentials and you can speak a certain way. And we all know we've experienced that, haven't we? Be truthful. All right. So our next stages that we go to are structural change, a redefining community. And this is moving us really towards becoming much more anti-racist in our looks, in our outcomes. We move beyond just being anti-racist, anti-sexist, and we see the benefits of a broad racial and cultural perspective. There's a willingness to struggle, and I think that's most of the people who are in this room today are here, at least because you're open to the idea of being willing to struggle. You have a willingness to share in problem solving. Policies, you're shaping policies and models for inclusive decision making in community life. Many of you who may be sitting out there who are going to be or are involved in the community at different levels, hopefully will come away from this forum and others like it with an understanding that you always have to think of how to be inclusive in your decision making and in your policies. And that will shape the way you look at people and the way you bring people into organizations and the way you educate, and the way you educate students. Okay, and then finally we get to inclusive, which would be a transformed community. And that is a community that's committed to confronting and dismantling racism throughout the larger community. It begins at a personal level, and the transformation process starts with your individual selves, but it has to go further. And hopefully what we're going to do here today is bring us a little further along on the continuum. You're going to create allies or work in coalition with others in combating social oppression. And that's the key word. I have a good friend, I used to serve on a Civil Rights Commission in New Jersey, and a good friend who was head of that was a person from the continent of India. And he says, you know, we're the originators of one of the most racist systems in the world, the caste system. But we haven't taken care of home. And so while I feel for people who are Dalit and other people who are oppressed in many, many areas of the world, I'm concerned here today with the United States of America. I'm concerned here with Cumberland County, Fayetteville. You know, that's what I'm concerned with, North Carolina, and the rest of the United States. Where are we in America? Because we can't look at other cultures and begin to make changes there until we're willing to look at ourselves and begin to make changes here. We tend not to want to look at the caste system that exists here. And we don't call it a caste system. And we don't even want to admit that we have classes in this country. Okay? So again, we're going to look inward today. And that doesn't, I don't want to diminish anyone else's oppression, whether it's gender, sexual orientation. There are so many oppressions. But we're going to look at this particular one today, here in the US of A, okay?